Welcome friends to today's session of Live Lectures. Today for this session we have with us Dr. Debashree Basu. Dr. Basu is Assistant Professor of English Literature. We like to tell you friends that today we are going to take you to the nostalgia of childhood. I think we all have studied Gulliver's Travel. Today's topic of discussion is a critical study of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travel. Let's welcome you all to this travel, and let's welcome Dr. Debashree Basu. We welcome you, Dr. Basu, and please take us to these childhood memories of all of us.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Morning everyone. Our concerned text today is Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Now, there are various reasons as to why this text remains till date as one of the fascinating prose satires ever written. There are several levels at which this text can be categorized. It is an exemplary example of a prose satire. It is a travelogue. It is a children's literature. But what remains specifically significant about this text till date is its modernity, its contemporaneity, and its relevance, because it has a very well defined socio-political dimension attached to it, which makes it relevant even in today's socio-political times. Jonathan Swift's works owes an exceptionally broad scope to the freedom and dissemination of its thought. Now, there are primarily some fundamental characteristic features regarding Swift's narrative style, which we can see in the PPT here. There was a latent romanticism in him, about him, despite the fact that he was a very conformed classical writer. Swift's demand for truth and destructive of all deceitful illusions is something that he has again and again stressed upon in his work. His preference for the observation of the golden mean. I will explain what golden mean means subsequently. The bitterness resulting from a long series of disappointments. He was not very successful professionally, and many thought that he was rallying against the world, which did not give him the success that he deserved. It's also a protest of a free mind against conventional lies, and that is there all throughout the 4 volumes of Gulliver's Travels. It is also an attack on certain forms of intellectual ambition, specifically in the 3rd part of Gulliver's Travels. We see that he is again and again denouncing the degraded intellectual pursuits of the age, which had no use whatsoever for the betterment of mankind. So, Gulliver's Travels carries the rational criticism of values to a point where it threatens and undermines the very reasons for living. Lucidity and search for balance, in his case, are therefore suffused with an intellectual emotion, concentrated and intense, which at times cannot be distinguished from an impassioned bitterness. Swift has often been criticized for being exceptionally cynical and bitter and sarcastic towards his writing as well as towards the readers, but it is eventually not so, and the expression of which, despite restraint of humor and irony, possesses a pathetic vehemence. But the force and the aggression with which he narrates his story, with which he narrates the typical socio-political conditions of his age, is exceptionally relevant and to the point. Swift's practical adhesion to moral or social beliefs is to all appearances a very sincere, honest and truthful act, and one which compels our respect and admiration. The moral figure of Swift is that of an eager demand for truth that destroys one by one all the deceitful illusions and of the suffering which accompanies that destruction. As a church dignitary mixed up in the controversies which separated the Anglicans from the other dissenting sects, Swift had to take a side. Though he wasn't an extremist in nature at all, but yet he had to take a side. He wrote numerous religious treatises, besides doctrinal sermons, sensible and calm in tone. So, for those who constantly attack his aggressive, vehement tone, they should also realize that there was a certain kind of calmness, there was a certain kind of restraint and a discipline in his narrative technique as well. He practiced his religion with more hidden regularity than apparent zeal. Extremes repelled him. His preferences laid in the observance of a golden mean. Now, the phrase which is there in the PPT, a phrase which means the middle path and an avoidance of extremes. He rallied against the argument of the Catholics, the strife and fanaticism of various sects. But in his reaction against the looseness of morals, he often went to the extent of eulogizing that very irony. For hypocrisy, according to him, after all, is much better than cynicism. Despite the conformity of his declarations and principles, Swift aroused a deep and secret unrest in the minds of those who were in powerful positions during his time. Although he was a favorite of a minister, he did not obtain the office of a bishop, which he believed he should expect. An unkind destiny always seemed to baffle his desires. All the more reason and all the more convenient for critics to brand him as a cynic, as a bitter person who is railing against the world, because it did not give him the success that he deserved. But there is more to the literary artist, Jonathan Swift. There is more to the man, Jonathan Swift, which eventually comes out and surfaces through the 4 books, despite the fact that mankind cuts a very, very ugly figure in all these 4 volumes of Gulliver's Travels. Yet, we should always remember that the cynicism and bitterness of Swift somehow or the other eclipsed and did not eclipse or overshadow his critical literary genius, which we should appreciate and respect. Now, Swift's targets in Gulliver's Travels. These are the fundamental points that he discusses. No trust in science, primarily because of the hopeless and the pointless intellectual pursuits that England was extremely involved and preoccupied with during his times. He did not have any particular trust in science because he felt that science at that point of time was not being innovative, experimentative enough for the betterment of mankind. Then a dark picture of political institutions. He was extremely vehement, he was extremely critical about the political misjudgments of the men in power during his time. He also paints a depressing picture of mankind, as we see in the slide. There is a substantial degree of pessimism in his writing. He was a champion of Irish causes and he constantly rallied against the fanaticism of England and English in order to suppress and oppress the Irish championship. The literary techniques that he uses throughout his work include irony, allegory, verve, ingenuity, concrete invention. He is a humorist as well as an ironist. So, despite the fact that we categorize Gulliver's Travels as an essential prose satire, where satire definitely features in a very big way, the underlying humor, the irony is also very, very apparent. And that is why, despite the fact that Lemuel Gulliver, who is the protagonist, he is the protagonist of the prose satire and he is there throughout all the 4 volumes, but Swift does not spare him from his satire, from his satirical remarks and his cynicism either. So, in order to broadly classify the targets in Gulliver's Travels, the book singularly broadens the indictment of the very effort by which human mind claims to know and to understand, because reason and rationalism were the 2 primary important notions, important features that 18th century, 19th century English literature was about. Philosophy appears in the light of an ambitious jargon, metaphysics, mystification, while theory becomes that sterile activity which shackles the play of practice in all domains. Swift does not seem to put any trust in science. He derided the erudite inferences of Newton's theory of gravitation, which according to him were playthings of thought. They were absolutely whimsical for him, but they were fashionable and then they passed away. So, for him, science whatever it was dabbling with during his age, was absolutely irrelevant and transient. The moderns have added nothing, according to him, which really matters to the sound reasoning of the ancients. This attention is aware of the innumerable failures of scientific conquests that had plagued his age. Swift paints a dark picture of political institutions and manners. He writes on the side of the opposition during the despised administration of Sir Robert Walpole. The book throws light of superior and destructive irony upon the smallness of the means, the vanity of the motives, through which kings retained their thrones, magistrates their offices, and from one end of the society to the other, there was this constant fearful influence of man upon man, which got shamelessly executed. Everything is attacked by him in his corrosive satire: monarchy, courts, courtiers, the wiles of the favourites of both the sexes, everything upon which rested the so-called contemporary administration of European civility. To serve the needs of his allegory, Swift transports us from the country of the dwarfs, which is there in the very first book, that is the book of the Lilliputs, to that of the giants, which is the land of the Brobdingnags. In the former, that is in book 1, everything is grotesque, and it's a despicable parody of that human reality which is invested by convention with great prestige. In the latter, that is in the second book, in the giant land of the Brobdingnags, it is the human reality which reveals itself as ridiculously small. Mankind, as I said earlier as well, cuts a very ugly figure throughout all the 4 volumes of Gulliver's Travels. To understand even a slight idea of a noble experience, Swift seems to think that one must forsake the human species. In the land of the philosophical horses, and this is in book 4, which is the land of the Hunims, human civilization is not understood, and in the lower depths of the civilized society of these quadrupeds, the ignoble race of the 2-footed monsters, the Yahoos, drag themselves along. What we call bestiality in civilized society is the very attribute of man. And in Swift's own words, his main intention behind writing Gulliver's Travel is this, and I quote him: "I have ever hated all nations, professions and communities, but principally I hate and detest that animal called man. Upon this great foundation of misanthropy, the whole building of my travels is erected." Now, as far as the integration of the 4 parts are concerned, when we talk about, since we are talking about genres primarily, and we all know that Gulliver's Travels is fundamentally a prose satire. Now, what do we consider a satire, a definition of satire, as we can see in the slide? Satire is a critical attitude which is mixed with humor and wit, generally for the purpose of improving humanity. So, it is not just to criticize humanity, but it is also to enlighten humanity. And it is also not only essentially concerned with being critical and being vehement, it is also concerned with lightening up the atmosphere, and hence humor and wit are essential ingredients of satire. An allegory of 18th century English politics, and it is a parody which is a satirical imitation of contemporary travel literature. So, these are the 3 genres with which Swift constantly dabbled throughout the 4 volumes of Gulliver's Travels. Now, the 4 books describe 4 fantastic journeys, fictional journeys undertaken by the protagonist Lemuel Gulliver. They are visits to 4 entirely different lands in which Gulliver gains new experience that appear to have insignificant connection to one another except the presence of the same protagonist or the same hero. So, at the surface level, one might think that it's only the presence of the hero, Lemuel Gulliver, that is the point of commonality across the 4 books, but it is not the same. There is a proper integration which is very seamless and that integrates all the four parts of the prose satire. In all the books, the author conveys to us the same truths about man and society despite their varied depictions. The integration also surfaces via Swift's satiric purpose of exposing the ambiguity and paradox of man's position between a beast and an angel, as is also described in Alexander Pope's Essays on Man. Gulliver's manner of reaching each island has a remarkable similarity in all the books. On the first occasion, a violent storm drives his ship Antelope and wrecks it by dashing it against a rock. During his second voyage on adventure, that is the name of his ship, his companions abandon him in seeing a giant near a creek. The incident reveals human betrayal and fear triumphing over courage. On his third journey on Hopewell, he is victimized by pirates. So you can essentially see that the name of the ships that he boards in all the four journeys, they are also extremely satirical in nature because they constantly talk against human civilized nature, which we think otherwise. On his third journey to Hopewell, he is victimized by pirates who rob him and set him adrift on a canoe. During the fourth voyage on adventure again, Gulliver's crew rise in mutiny against him and leave him on an unknown land. These incidents show the increasing cruelty and moral degeneration of man revealed through the main episodes of the book. In all the four books, Gulliver is introduced to unknown societies, their socio-political realities, cultures and customs through the literary devices of political allegory, travel literature, utopia, dystopia, myth and satire. Swift follows the tendency of beginning each of the books as a simple travelogue, but concluding it as a moral lesson against vice and corruption. Gulliver's Travels features in a big way in children's literature section as well, but primarily the very first part of it, which is Gulliver in the Land of the Lilliputians. But the size and dimensions of the Lilliputians, the smallness of their size becomes metaphorical to the small because it reflects the smallness of their nature as well. The cruelty, the shrewdness, the manipulative nature of Lilliputians are a far cry from the naive, innocent world of children's. The first book is populated with themes of alienation, imprisonment, dominion and measurement. Though small, the Lilliputians have intelligence with immense mathematical and mechanical skills. The huge body of Gulliver is transported by the remarkable engineering skill of the builders on a machine devised by them. Their mechanical skills look forward to the technological fantasies of the third book, in which the Laputans, that is the flying island of Laputa, transform their intellectual obsessions into concrete realities. However, they end up in absurd and impractical achievements like the shoulder of a mutton cut into an equilateral triangle, a piece of beef into rhomboid, and pudding into cycloid. Thus, Swift satirizes vain and obsessive intellectual pursuits, which mean nothing and have no bearing on the betterment and progression of mankind. In the first book, Gulliver observes the rope dancing and the leaping and creeping at the emperor's court. These are some important episodes from book 1 of Gulliver's Travels. For political benefit, which mirrored the contemporary political situation of Britain. The two Lilliputian parties, Tramexen and Slamexen, are satirical portraits of the Tories and the Whigs. The conflict between Lilliput and the neighbouring island of Blefuscu reveals England's constant war with France between 1689 to 1697 and the Spanish War of Succession from 1701 to 1713. In the third book, the description of the flying island of Laputa and its connection with the main island reflects England's control over Ireland and its tyranny on the Irish people through penal laws and unjust taxation. The analyzing power of Swift, revealing the gradual increase of size and proportion in the first two books, indicates steady degeneration of human behavior and moral values. The stunted size of the Lilliputians complements their meanness and shrewdness. Despite Gulliver's kindness to them, they cruelly impeach him and even propose to blind him. In the second book, the physical hugeness of the giants is matched by their simple, incorrupt and benevolent manners. Swift reveals the conniving and contriving nature of man when Gulliver proudly explains to the giant king of the Brobdingnags the several intricacies of political life, social theories of the government and the atrocities of war that his country engages in, excels in and revels at. After hearing him, the giant king of the Brobdingnags conclude that human beings are, and I quote Swift from the text, the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffused to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Swift also brings about a few reversals in Gulliver's experience. In book 1, Gulliver's massive size in front of the small Lilliputians gives him a sense of superiority. In book 2, his smallness evokes insecurity. Physicality is presented as repulsive and grotesque when Gulliver observes a cancerous tumor on a beggar woman's breast and later faints due to the body odor of the maid of honor. This same revulsion for physicality is further emphasized in book 4 by the debased vulgarity of the Yahoos and their obnoxious excretory habits. Though Gulliver is a constant presence in all the 4 books, there is a gradual change in him. So, from an enthusiastic traveler and explorer of book 1, we see that he becomes a very bitter, cynical man and a hater of mankind till at the end of book 4. There is a gradual change, as I said, in the protagonist Lemuel Gulliver from an enthusiastic traveler in book 1 to a misanthrope in book 4 who consciously imitates the behavior of the Houyhnhnms. And this is one remarkable quality that Jonathan Swift gives to Gulliver in Gulliver's Travels, where despite the fact that Gulliver becomes his mouthpiece to a great extent, he also becomes the object of Swift's scathing satire. He becomes Swift's reference point in order to criticize the gradual, debased, bestial and degenerate nature of man. In the 4th book, Swift criticizes the idealization of reason in the 18th century that led to the neglect of all other human attributes through the Houyhnhnms, who are thoroughly cold and detached towards the elders, unemotional towards their spouses and family. Swift implies that a balance of reason and emotion, the head and the heart can alone lead towards a perfect, balanced, humane existence. Though the book appears to be a fictitious journey of the protagonist to 4 fantastic lands, it is actually a metaphorical journey exploring different facets of man and society. Now, if we come to the very first slide again, which talks about the characteristic features of Swift's writing, all these features become exceptionally important or fundamentally necessary when we talk about Jonathan Swift as a narrator. So, we cannot assess his literary genius or the literary genius of the text or the merit of the text until and unless we talk about him as the narrator. Swift's narrative technique in the books is a complex one told through the eyes of the narrator protagonist. The different land that he visits are made to represent human vice, folly and depravity. We will continue more on the narrative technique on the other side of the break.
Thank you, Dr. Basu. And we thank you all for joining us for this part of the session. We'll join you after a short break with the next part of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travel. We'll take you to that nostalgia back. Welcome back, friends, to the second part of the session. We are extremely sorry for taking you back from the nostalgia of your childhood, but we are back with that nostalgia. Let's welcome Dr. Debashri Basu once again, and let's ask her to take us back to that nostalgia once again. Well, we welcome you back, Dr. Basu, and please take us to that childhood memories once again.
Thank you. So, to continue from where we had left a few moments ago, this section will primarily focus on the narrative technique and the narrative genius of Jonathan Swift. Swift's narrative technique in the books is a complex one told through the eyes of the narrator protagonist, Lemuel Gulliver. The different lands that he visits are made to represent vice, folly and depravity. However, Gulliver is shown to view these lands as strange, unknown, exotic places with their own customs and conventions. He is not exactly in a position to analyze, critically evaluate the metaphorical significance and relevance of these lands. He sees them with an awe, with an admiration, and that is all that there is. Now, what is interesting and also what is very sarcastic as well as satiric about Gulliver's portrayal is the very name that Swift has given to him. He is a very gullible person, and that is precisely why he is called Gulliver. So, as I said, that it is not just about being the mouthpiece of Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver himself is also the object of Swift's scathing attack, because by the end of fourth book, we see Gulliver's degeneration to a misanthrope. Gulliver marvels at all these various lands and is filled with awe and wonderment, revealing that Swift uses Gulliver more as a gullible person in his satire rather than as his mouthpiece. Gulliver is seen reporting every incident that he observes in Lilliput as being novel and strange. Though Swift makes him describe these details with a very close resemblance to the social realities of England, Gulliver fails to understand it. However, the readers are aware of Swift's ironical intention of satirizing England obliquely via the disguise of the gullible Gulliver. In Book 2, it is Gulliver's description of his own world that is ironically satirized by the author than the world he visits. The island of the giant Brobdingnags, despite their physical deformity, has a promise of utopia. But Gulliver is unaware of the vice and depravity of his own world and narrates to the giant king its gruesome realities with pride and self-satisfaction. It is in response to the king's question that Gulliver gives him detailed information about the English Parliament, the English courts of justice and the management of the English treasury, explaining the atrocities of war that his country excels in. Through the king's opinion, Swift reduces England to a series of rebellions, revolutions and wars that generate violence and destruction and are totally misplaced in nature. In Book 3, Swift makes Gulliver marvel at the scientific innovations of the Laputans, while Swift attacks their obsessions. The book mirrors the genre of science fiction fantasy, parodying the intellectual aspirations and pursuits encouraged by the Royal Society of England during Swift's time. Divorced from reality, the Laputan scientists spend much of their time in harnessing energy from nature and are concerned with the geometrical shape of food that they consume. So, whether they are cut in a rhomboid shape or in a circloid shape, that is what they are more concerned with, rather than using science and technology in those days for the advancement and progression of mankind. Swift becomes scathingly critical towards his protagonist in Book 4. The animal-like Hunims are rational than the Yahoos, who, though possess human forms, have all the bestial qualities, being driven by their base instincts, barbarism and savagery. Gulliver cannot comprehend the inflamed desire of the Yahoos, their obnoxious excretory habits and amoral attitude towards life. However, he commits a mistake by disowning his people on his return to England, developing a distaste and abhorrence for all that is human, and longs for the companionship of the Houyhnhnms. Through Gulliver, Swift attacks his misanthropic attitude towards life that fails to comprehend that it is the balance of reason and emotion that completes the constitution of man. The fourth book thus completes the full cycle of fantasy to highlight the satire cast upon various aspects of human life. In the first three books, we observe Gulliver's inability to morally and ethically analyze the situations. He only has instantaneous reactions and no consolidated understanding of his experience. In the fourth book, by holding rationality supreme, Gulliver brings about a rift in his human persona. Gulliver's romance with reason fails to convince him of the importance of a great expanse of life, that is emotion. Thus, he comes under the critical eye of Swift and is censured for divorcing passion from reason, degrading the former deliberately for a better life. Through this double irony, Swift seems to challenge the readers into understanding the right satiric perspective from the possible mistake of identifying with the gullible Gulliver. So, it is not that Gulliver is not the focus of the text. It is also not that Gulliver is not the protagonist of the text. But if we consider Gulliver as the hero of the text, and by hero here I mean that if we conventionally associate heroic abilities to Gulliver, then he is most definitely not so. Even if we do see some heroic qualities that he displays in book 1 of Gulliver's Travels, where he helps the Laputans in order to fight and win the battle against Blefuscans, yet the heroism in Gulliver gets gradually degraded and ultimately somewhat vanishes towards the end of the fourth book. Now, Gulliver's Travels is primarily categorized as a satire, as a prose satire. So, it is quite obvious that the distinctive features, the characteristic features of satire will get justified throughout the expanse of the book. So, in order also to focus that how satire became an important literary device for Swift to narrate Gulliver's Travels, the ultimate purpose of satire, as the slide says, is a critical attitude mixed with humor and wit, generally for the purpose of improving humanity. So, despite the fact that Jonathan Swift has been scathingly critical towards mankind, and mankind cuts an ugly figure throughout the four parts of Gulliver's Travels, we cannot deny the fact that he has also constantly tried to be educative, tried to enlighten man to his base natures, so that he is able to rectify him in the first place. So, keeping this definition of satire in mind, that it is a critical attitude mixed with humor and wit, generally for the purpose of improving humanity, we see that the ultimate purpose of satire is not the exposure of vice and folly, but the correction of these limitations. So, the rectification part of a satire is a very significant dominant feature of this genre. In Gulliver's Travels, Swift employs satire and ridicule to expose man and society in the first three books. However, though these books point out the defects of the fantastic worlds, they signify the hope of change and corruption. But the fourth book strikes scathingly at the base nature of man. The grim and debased view of mankind that Swift provides in this book often verges on cynicism and a tragic realization of man's fallen state, from which he may never be redeemed. However, if we deal analytically with the fourth book, we will realize that it is the subtle difference between the author and the narrator which reveals to us Swift's real satiric purpose, which is neither cynical nor tragic. So, there is a slight difference. That is why if we allow ourselves to treat Lemuel Gulliver as the narrator and as the mouthpiece of Jonathan Swift, we might overlook the subtle difference that is there in between the author of the Gulliver's Travels and the narrator of the Gulliver's Travels. The narrator of Gulliver's Travels, who is Gulliver, is gullible, has his own limitations, and to a certain extent damaged beyond repair, if I may be allowed to say so. But Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, wants to a certain extent look beyond that damage and sincerely wants a certain kind of repair and a certain kind of reformation. In a letter to Alexander Pope dated 29 September 1725, it was a year before Gulliver's Travels was published. It was published in 1726, and interestingly enough, perhaps it is the only book for which Jonathan Swift was ever paid. Swift commented on the nature of his satire in that letter to Pope, stating, and I quote Swift over here, "The chief end I propose to myself in all my labours is to vex the world rather than divert it." Unquote. Yet, malice was never his aim. He lashed the vice, but he spared the man, as he himself states in another of his major work, Verses on the Death of Dr. Swift. Many critics consider Gulliver's Travels as a product of a lonely and bitter man who is rallying against the world that denied him a successful career in church and also in politics. But unlike Gulliver, who finally concludes that man is unredeemable, Swift believed in man's development through a balance of virtue, reason, and emotion. In the first book, Swift dwells on the political corruptions revealed through the shrewdness and crafty nature of the Lilliputians. With the help of mathematical and mechanical skills, they have built up a superficially intricate and immaculate culture with all its customs and conventions. Gulliver's reports in the tone of a naive wonder and amazement about their great achievement were Swift's satirical attack against British politics, its intrigues and its corruptions. The two Lilliputian parties, Tramaxon and Slamaxon, represented by the high heels and the low heels respectively, are Swift's satiric exposure of the high-charged Tories and the low-charged Whigs. The perpetual Lilliputian-Bluefesco conflict highlights England's constant hostile relationship with France. The Lilliputian emperor represents George I, Bolgolam is the Earl of Nottingham, Flimnap is Robert Walpole, and Gulliver himself is probably Bolingbroke. The satire in this book is not directed against any particular individual, but rather again addresses the larger moral, ethical and religious issues concerning man. Gulliver's ego, having been inflated in Book 1 by his proportional superiority over the little men, is shattered by his demolition to a petty creature in Book 2. So, it cannot be just by accident that Swift makes Gulliver visit the land of Lilliputians in Book 1, where his ego gets significantly inflated because he considers himself to be superior, to be massive, to be very, very powerful in front of the small Lilliputians. And the very next book, in the giant land of the Brobdingnans, we have Gulliver getting reduced to, in his physicality in front of the giant kings and his kingdom. Gulliver's ego, having been inflated in Book 1 by his proportional superiority over the little men, is shattered by his demolition to a petty creature in Book 2. The meanness and viciousness of the Lilliputians is now possessed by Gulliver, while the king of the Brobdingnags represents an alternate view of humanity as being generous and possessing moral and ethical values. In Book 3, Swift attacks the scientific obsessions of his day and the tendency of over-intellectualizing the reality. he derides a great deal of humour out of the absurd projects of the Laputans, from extracting sunbeams from cucumbers to students swallowing wafers with geometrical properties, so that they may easily learn and digest without learning geometry. The attempt of the Laputans to reform language by replacing all right. Okay.
Hello.
Hello, ma'am. Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Yes, ma'am. My name is Pawan, and I want to ask a question.
Yes, sure.
Please.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Please ask your question.
Yes, ma'am. I want to know, ma'am, how we compare the different ways of Gulliver to different country, and what is the outcome of this, and what is the message conveyed from this?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, then you are trying to analyze and understand that what is the message that Jonathan Swift is actually trying to give. Now, I have already said in the course of my lecture that Gulliver's Travels is essentially a prose satire which talks at length about the socio-political dimensions of the age. Now, through Gulliver's Travels, or rather through the character of Lemuel Gulliver and his visits to all these fictional fantastic lands, Swift is actually trying to show the moral degeneration of man gradually in every book and in every land that Gulliver goes. So, there is a constant graph, not only in the degeneration in the character of Gulliver, but also in the degeneration in the character of the other lands and of the people that Gulliver meets eventually, book after book. So, because it is a satire, and obviously there is a certain kind of rectification that is also involved within it. So, it is not only that Swift is trying to rectify the policies, or at least trying to protest and resist against the political problems, against the socio-economical misjudgments that England was taking at that point of time. He is also trying to show through the character of Gulliver, who has become the prototype of a base, degenerate man, that if we do not have a perfect balance in our life of reason and emotion, then our ideas, our pursuits, our intellect, or whatever we try to achieve in life, are going to be absolutely futile and fruitless. So, all these images of the lands, as well as Gulliver per se as the narrative protagonist, becomes metaphorical of that satirical purpose that Swift wants to achieve through Gulliver's Travels. I hope that answers your question.
We may go further to the topic,
All
ma'am,
right.
and we'll wait for any other call.
All right. Now, so to continue from where we stopped earlier, in the first book, Swift delves on the political corruption revealed through the shrewdness and crafty nature of the Lilliputians. With the help of mathematical and mechanical skills, they have built up a superficially intricate and immaculate culture with all its customs and conventions. Gulliver's reports in the tone of naive wonder and amazement about their great achievements without actually thinking much. So, when he sees the Lilliputians as an exceptionally modern and civilized society, he feels that they are one of the perfect races that is there around him. So, it's the two Lilliputian parties, Tramixen and Slamixen, obviously represented by their high heels and their low heels, are Swift's satiric exposure of the high-charged Tories and the low-charged Whigs. The perpetual Lilliput-Blefuscu conflict highlights England's hostile relationship with France, which created a huge dent in the economy and the treasury of England, needless to say. The Lilliputian emperor represents George I, Bolgolam is the Earl of Nottingham, Flimnap is Walpole, Sir Robert Walpole, and Gulliver himself is Bolingbroke. The satire in all his books, not only in book 1 but in all the 4 volumes, are not addressed to one particular individual. Rather, it is addressed to the society that made him think deeply and inspired him in an ironical way to write something satiric and sarcastic in nature in the form of Gulliver's Travels. Gulliver's ego gets inflated in book 1 because of his massive size, and it gets deflated in book 2 because of his smallness. In book 3, Swift attacks the scientific obsessions of his day and the tendency of over-intellectualizing the reality. He derives a great deal of humor out of the absurd projects of the Laputans, from extracting sunbeams from cucumbers to students swallowing wafers. Now, this entire act of swallowing wafers metaphorically means that when a student just has to swallow something without understanding and analyzing anything, so that particular act of mindless, pointless memorization is what gets categorized and what gets scathingly criticized through this act of swallowing cucumbers with sunbeams going through them without actually having to understand anything about it. The attempt of the Laputans to reform language by replacing words with things is Swift's jibe against the Royal Society's overindulgence in intellectual excesses, as well as its neglect of philosophical issues for the sake of empiricism. The fourth book has actually invited a lot of criticism due to Swift's grim vision of mankind through an inversion of the usually held man-beast position. Now, in the civilized terms, we usually consider Homo sapiens, human beings, featuring at the topmost level of social ladder, society's ladder of civilization. Jonathan Swift completely subverts this in book 4, where he makes the yahoos, who have the human forms, as the most bestial and debased of all creatures, and makes the horses, the four-legged horses, the quadrupeds, as a metaphorical symbol of reason. The fourth book, therefore, has invited a lot of criticism due to Swift's grim vision of mankind. Through an inversion of the usually held man-beast position, he depicts men with the worst of bestial features by describing them as yahoos. On the other hand, the beast is elevated to the rational hunimts. The satire here verges on the tragic when Gulliver, in a horrifying shock, recognizes himself to basically belonging to the same species as the yahoos. His loathing for them is a form of self-disgust. Man uses his clothes and civilized institutions to suppress his animality. He is shocked to see a female yahoo, inflamed with desire, attempting to approach him when he had taken off his clothes to take a bath. Gulliver's subsequent insanity results from being unable to integrate the rational and the impulsive facets of man. He fails to understand that despite the rational ideal, the horses are cold and unemotional, even towards their spouses and children. The cynicism and misanthropy result out of Gulliver's inability to accept the middle position of man, that is between angel and beast. The next section, which also to a certain extent incorporates the use of satire in Gulliver's Travels, is primarily deals with the use of fantasy in Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. The main intention of a satirist is to expose and criticize the folly, vice and depravity of individuals, communities or mankind at large. We will continue with our discussion in the next segment of our lecture.
Thank you, ma'am, for this nostalgic travel of Gulliver's Travel, and we thank you, friends, for joining us for this session. If you have any suggestion or questions regarding this session, you may write in to us at our mail ID, which is info.cec@nic.in. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Basu.